Hello, and welcome to another episode of Muview with Mo. This time I will be talking with my friend Khanh To, who is a fellow paleontology PhD student here at Virginia Tech. Khanh, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, my name is Khanh To, and I am a third year PhD student at Virginia Tech, and I am with the paleobiology group here, and I focus a lot on bridging the gap between animals that are still living now and animals that are extinct. So understanding the anatomy of birds currently is what my study subject are, and their extinct relatives.
I like to conceptualize how people get into paleontology as going kind of along one or two paths, that people either go into paleontology via the geology route, kind of the rock side of things, or the biology route, and kind of the soft, squishy living bits kinds of things. And the people we've had on the show so far have been paleontologists who approach things from the rock side of things. And so, Khanh, I'm glad you're in here today to talk a little bit more about the squishier, softer side of the science.
I think it was much easier for me to get into the squishier side of the science because when I was younger, I never had the opportunity to go out and like explore the rocky side of things. Um, so I think I got into the squishy side of things just because of exposure, but I do enjoy my field work and just like hanging out on the rocks and enjoying the sun and things like that.
You're also a great fan of herpetology in general and reptiles, and so I imagine you have that in common with like your pet snake Frank. That both of you probably enjoy some good time out on the rocks and sun.
I'm a little reluctant to take him outside sometimes because I know there are hawks around. And it's just an irrational fear that this hawk will dive bomb my snake. So maybe once I get over that fear, we'll take Frank outside and let him have a little sun in.
You just got to get yourself like one of those little snake leashes where it's got like two little loops that you tie around his belly, and you have him just on a leash, and you go out walking your snake.
I saw those. It's just a little hard to get your hand on a snake leash since it's not as common as, a dog leash.
Or it's like I've told you before, you need to get a really, really big hamster ball and just put Frank inside of that so he can crawl forward and see how he responds to being in a hamster ball.
You know, I wonder if a clear beach ball would work.
If you could get him inside and blow it up.
What? We'll think about that.
Yeah. So, Khanh, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about your background, kind of where you grew up, how you came to be here at Virginia Tech and into this aspect of the sciences?
Of course. So I was born in Vietnam and I was there for about 10 years before I moved to the States. And once in the States, I was in Oklahoma and I got my undergrad there also. Oklahoma is quite technically in the middle of the United States, and I would like to say that it's slightly in the middle of nowhere, if anything. And it's interesting growing up in the middle of nowhere. Um, I have exposure to about the same exposure to different career choices as I would, I don't know, as you would think being in the middle of nowhere. We are highly, we call that influenced by the oil industry. And so it was either I would go into the oil industry or, engineering or being a doctor, which is what my mom wants me to do. A medical doctor, not a doctor of philosophy.
Yeah, my mom supports me going into paleontology, but I know deep down a part of her really thinks I should be a lawyer.
I'm glad you understand that because she's like, oh, you gotta be a doctor. And I was like, not the kind that cure people because it's a lot. That's a lot of commitment for somebody uh, who doesn't have the motivation for it, for sure. I think it's even more commitment for people who have a interest in it and background for it. But yeah.
The way
Um,
I take a look at it is, one of the things I enjoy about my aspect of science is that if I really, really mess up someday in the lab or while I'm doing research, the worst normal thing that happens is I drop a rock on my foot, or maybe I douse myself with a little bit of acid, which isn't great and it hurts me.
Yeah.
But, if I'm a doctor, like a medical doctor, and I mess up, there are much bigger consequences to mistakes. And so,
Yeah, I agree. The responsibility is much greater. But aside from that, my mom also wanted me to do pharmacy, which is what some of my family member have gone into. And so that was some of the career path that my mom laid out to me. And at some point, I decided I did not like that, and I changed my chemical engineering major into a geology and biology dual degree. And I did that, and then I realized my mom would be able to see my grade and what my majors are if she saw my transcript. And I was like, I'm going to come clean. So then I came clean to her after switching and was like, this is it. I'm staying here. This is where it makes me happy. I just found, I looked at the courses that I was going to take as a chemical engineer, and I just felt no motivation for it. And they're relatively hard classes since I end up rooming with quite a few engineers, and I could see, the stress and them working through these things. And I was just like, wow, if for somebody who have motivation for these sort of career and they're struggling like this, for somebody who doesn't, this is a path that is not going to look great. So after that, I got into paleo and geology, or biology and geology. There was no paleontologist on my campus. I don't know if there's an ironic thing or not, but the paleontologist that was on campus in the geo department either retired or passed away the semester that I switched over. So we never got a paleo course in our department, but I end up going to Tulsa in one of the, I guess, outposts of the college, the medical school
like
of the, I
like the remote campus.
wouldn't say a remote campus. I would just say just a different campus location.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And it's a medical school. And that's where I got into the squishy bit of paleo, which was what I wanted to do anyways. And I think I had a great time being there. My advisor, the other professors in the group was absolutely amazing at introducing me into paleo. They showed me how to do prep work. They showed me how to do like micro picking work. I got to do dissection. I got to be introduced to various other researchers that came for talks. We went for a conference. And so I think that was my true dip into paleontology. And it was through the medical side of things.
Nice, nice. I remember a couple of times you've told us about one of your advisors' more interesting hobbies.
Oh, God.
That one of your undergrad advisors was very into noodling.
Oh, that is not my undergrad advisor. That
Oh,
is my high school biology teacher. Shout out to Mr. Moss. He was incredible to get me back into biology again in high school. I hope you're doing well, Mr. Moss. But I enjoy all of his, not ranting, but stories about his time noodling and being the cast of Mudcats. That was A+ time for us.
one thing that you mentioned that you got a lot of out as an undergrad, and that I know that you continue to do a lot of work with now as a grad student, is that you do a lot of comparative dissections of modern creatures to better understand their anatomy and how that could relate to the functional anatomy of ancient organisms. What are some interesting creatures that you've dissected either as an undergrad or now here as a grad student that you feel have been either unusual creatures or particularly informative in terms of teaching you about functional anatomy?
So I end up doing a lot of digital dissection and along with hand dissection. So what that means is that hand dissection is what you would think dissection to be. You put the specimen down on a tray, you cut it open with a scalpel, and then you go layer by layer to figure out the tissue layers that is in an animal, like what kind of muscles are anchoring onto maybe the femur or things like that. And so there are multiple layers of muscles that are usually anchored um, onto a bone, and then you go layer by layer, and you match it up with what kind of muscles have been described and things like that. So very standard, those are standard dissection. But digital dissection is a little less invasive in that matter, so that we usually do a scan of the specimen, which a CT scan will allow you to see into the specimen based on the density of the specimen. So because the bones is a lot more dense than the soft tissue, the first scan will allow you to see the skeletal structure of the specimen. And then there's usually some sort of contrast staining dye that we will end up giving to the specimen, like have it soak in that particular dye so that the soft tissue becomes more dense than the bone. So then we CT scan that again, and that second scan is how we're able to look at the soft tissue on the computer. So then we do a digital dissection. So using those CT scans, we then reconstruct the soft tissue on top of the skeletal tissue, and therefore we are able to essentially dissect into the specimen without physically taking a scalpel and dissecting it.
Longtime fans of the podcast might remember my interview with Chris Griffin, and he talks about some of his research where he does something very similar. To compare and contrast those two methods, what Chris does is he, like Khan, stains biological specimens with different dyes such that different tissues like bone, cartilage, and organs show up in different colors under optical microscopy. And he adjusts the focal length of the samples that he's looking at, so that way he can kind of build a layer by layer stack of images of the creatures that he's working with, where Khan, by contrast, she does the same sort of dyeing and staining, but instead of doing optical microscopy, she gets a CT scan, a CAT scan, essentially, of the specimens. And then using the same software, she's also able to look at layer by layer visualizations of these tissues that have different density contrasts because of the dyes and because of their inherent density characteristics.
Yes. So when we scan those specimens, they show up as different grayscale. Those grayscale value indicating like how dense they are or how quote unquote empty it is, which is like free space and things like that. So then we go into software that helps us, process these images, and we reconstruct the soft tissue from there on. This is a relatively non-invasive but slightly destructive method. Some of the dyeing method can be reversible for specimens, but some are not. So if one does want to go into this, do consult the literature to see which one will be best to fit into what you need. But all that aside, kind of thing, once I am able to digitally dissect the particular specimen, on the computer, it is much easier for us to measure out the precise volume, the precise weight, and those sort of measurements for smaller specimens, because a lot of my specimens that I study are relatively small. So measuring them can be a little bit of a challenge for sure.
And I think I need to correct myself there. I think do you and Chris actually use the same software, or do you guys use different stuff? Like you work primarily on Aviso, right?
Yes.
And do you know, does Chris use Aviso?
I think Chris might have used Aviso for a little while, but I'm not 112% sure.
So there are a couple of very powerful softwares that basically all they do is that they're complex image processing software that allows you to cut up CT scans or stacks of images into distinct layers and then superimpose them such that, you know, the software can then connect features between those, so you can do these dissections, these digital dissections that Khan does. And some of the major softwares of this type are things like Viso, Mimics, and the freeware Dragonfly, which Dragonfly is freeware. So if you want to play around with your own, say, CT scans, if you ever go to a doctor and want to see what your own innards look like, you can potentially download Dragonfly. I will say, having downloaded Dragonfly on a computer before, during the setup process, they ask you some unusual questions. I don't remember exactly what all they asked, but I was setting this up on Michelle's Stalker's computer, Khan's advisor and one of our 3 paleontologists at Virginia Tech. And she has 2 big computer setups that run these sorts of digital dissection software. And I was setting up Dragonfly on one. And I remember, like, I had to send some emails to Michelle asking her some, like, weird personal information of hers that Dragonfly needed for some reason to set up. So it wasn't like bad stuff. It was just like, I don't entirely understand why you're asking this, but oh well. And so that's my experience with downloading the software. But I will say these software bundles are huge programs that are very computer intensive. Like Michelle, she has 2 computer setups for this, and one of them is like a rigged out Alienware thing.
Yeah. Just because the image stacks are usually very large, and their data, like, I think an image stack, a raw image stack, before it is processed of, depending on how high resolution you want your specimen to have, I think the largest one I had was almost 50 gigabyte, just completely raw, uncut, unedited. And I think after we trimmed it down, it went to maybe about 15 gigabyte. And when you open these particular image stack in the software for you to ultimately segment, the software essentially pulls up these different view of the image stack that it's creating. And so you have like the XY, and then the YZ, and then the ZX view, you know, the 3 axis. But because it's bringing up all 3 view at the same time, including also, you know, like another view of the whole project, a lot of time this takes an incredible amount of RAM power. And so, you know, opening up a 15 gigabyte image stack will require about 46 gigabyte worth of RAM memory, which is just a lot of power for any sort of machine to be doing.
Why waste your graphic card's power, you know, running something like Halo at 120 FPS, 9K resolution, when instead you could be using it to visualize the tiny ligaments inside the skull of baby chickens? Truly, exactly. That's what it's made for.
That's what I'm saying. Like, I don't understand. Yes, I completely agree with you there. Press F for respect.
Speaking of the cranial ligaments of baby chickens, Khan, would you like to talk a little bit about some of your current research projects?
Yeah, so my current research project, so my big research project anyways, is looking at the jaw musculature in birds and understanding how it changed throughout development. So from a hatchling to an adult. If you think about birds and when they are babies, you either have the image of a very fluffy, small yellow chicken that runs around with its mom, or you immediately imagine the closed eyes, really naked, really squealy, like finch hatchling. And these different,
those scary kind of red, pink, huge, dark eyes kind of bulging out from under their eyelids.
Yes.
Just
most definitely. And then there are some finch that have like these essentially like mouth markers on them that's sort of like fluorescent looking. Oh man, it's a trip to look at those. I can't look at those. But
it's kind of like a target for the mama bird to aim for the mama bird or the dad bird when they're giving the regurgitated bugs or whatever they're feeding them.
most definitely. But if you think about that, you immediately see that within birds themselves, there are several different developmental pathway that a bird could take. They could be completely defenseless and completely reliant on their parent at the start of their birth, and then they grow into, their adult form, or they could come out of the egg, be relatively independent of their parents, and go on and become their adult form.
It's kind of,
And go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, it's kind of like it's very easy to imagine the difference of a creature, like us humans, where our babies are very, very dependent on mama and papa for quite a long period of time. Where, and you go out and watch like a nature documentary, and some antelope out on the African savannah, gives birth to a calf, and like minutes later, it's walking away with mama to avoid some cheetah or lion that wants to come and eat it.
Yeah, exactly. So these different developmental pathway we hypothesize will be reflected upon the way they eat. So for the chicks that came out and is already walking around, pecking its own food and things like that, its jaw musculature system and their feeding strategy here should be relatively develop enough to function. Whereas for a chick that comes out and becomes really dependent on their parent and things like that, their particular jaw musculature and feeding apparatus doesn't have to be that developed. It just needs to be able to open its mouth and not really anything else. So going off of this, we are trying to look at several different species that represent different type of developmental mode and see whether how much development is affecting their growth, their feeding system. All of this gives us a better understanding of how the feeding apparatus is integrated into birds as a whole, and give us so when we do reconstruction in fossils, we use a lot of the data that comes from modern animals. So here, the data that we generate in this particular study allow us to better reconstruct how a bird skull would, their fossil relative, how their skull would look and how their jaw musculature would be. So that is more of the long-term goal of this particular study, but our short-term goal is to understand how growth affect the feeding structure of these particular birds.
Nice, nice. So one other thing that I like talking about in these interviews are museums that you enjoy, museums that you've worked with, and museums that you'd like to visit someday.
Okay. My very first museum that I've ever gone to as a person, and I think I've never gone to a museum when I was a child. That's not just the place that my family goes to, and I think it's kind of a social and cultural kind of thing. But the first museum I've ever gone to, I made a whole trip out of it, and it was the Smithsonian. It was my first museum, my first road trip, to be honest, by myself after getting a car and things like that. And it was amazing. I went with a roommate. We got there when the museum was started opening, and we didn't leave until like 10 minutes before it closed. We just split up our time, and then we just went out and about. But the museum that I really enjoy working with as a researcher now is one that I went to recently, which is the Field Museum. The Field Museum is in Chicago, and while their specimen collection isn't as large as the Smithsonian one, I really enjoy the layout of the museum. It's a little maze-like, which I feel like if you're going into a museum, you want to get lost in the materials. You want to, I don't want to say be one with the materials, but essentially, you're here to learn and you're here to see a completely different world. And I think the Pew Museum does a very good job of that in terms of their display and the way their display connect to each other. A museum that I would like to go to though, oh man, there's so many, especially if you include the one from Europe.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh my gosh, there's just so many. Um,
This is kind of off topic, but last week I listened to an interesting talk about an Ediacaran fossil called Charnia, given by a researcher at the Oxford Museum of Natural History, which I spent a month in Oxford as an undergrad, and so I got to visit that museum several times, which is a really great space. And one of the things that I think is coolest about the Oxford Museum of Natural History is it's essentially one really big room with two floors
mhm,
and with a front entrance.
yeah.
And the back wall of the Oxford Museum of Natural History is the entrance to the Pitt Rivers Museum of Anthropology, which is another, it's basically the same big two-story box with
Yeah.
tons of collections, and it's an extensive anthropological collection of essentially material that British imperialists brought back with them.
Ah, isn't there a whole thing about how people are requesting those materials back to the country of origin?
I know that's certainly a huge issue with the British Museum. Uh, it's very easy to imagine that the Pitt Rivers Museum is probably experiencing a lot of similar calls, but I am not as familiar with the Pitt Rivers situation on that as I am with the British museums.
Yeah, there's something about walking through a paleo anthropological museum that I find it very hard myself to go through with another person because I feel like that time for me to walk through that section of the museum is such a self-reflectant time of me either as a person or me as a cultural representation of my, I don't know, my species. I feel like that's a little broad, but it's interesting to stare at some of these faces and some of these go, and while they're very different, they're very similar. And I don't know. I think a good paleoanthropological um, setting of the displays should invoke that sort of emotion in you and make you think about what we have done as a civilization, as a group, and that we should be ref- constantly reflecting on what we have done and what we can change for the future.
I have some similar feelings on that. When I was much younger, like elementary school age, I was really, really into Egyptology. And
Who was not? Oh my God. Let me tell you something about being obsessed with the Egyptians.
and so, it's like I joke, every 8-year-old's into dinosaurs. Most 8-year-olds are also pretty into Egypt and mummies.
Yes.
I was fortunate in that I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, a very close distance to Emory University, which is home to the Carlos Museum, which is a anthropological museum that has very extensive collections of a lot of both North and South American, Native American artifacts, but also a very well represented ancient Egyptian collection. And I really enjoyed that as a kid. In fact, I was very lucky, and I was living in Georgia and got to visit the Carlos Museum during the time period that King Ramses II's mummy was making its international tour across the world and made a pit stop in the Carlos Museum. And so I got to see that ancient and venerable royalty. But since then, a lot of my feelings on Egyptology have changed in that, there are, I think it's one thing to view mummies of a public figure like Ramses II, who was a huge public figure in life and doesn't necessarily, I feel, have the same claims to privacy that other people did. But when you go to these museums that have Egyptology collections, they have mummies of different common laborers, of medium scale priests, and all sorts of people who weren't huge public individuals. And over time, I've grown more uncomfortable with the way that mummies and that aspect of Egyptology is presented to the public. That's certainly something to think about in terms of anthropological and paleoanthropological collections. Like you were saying, Khan, is that, so many of our relatives, obviously we're Homo sapiens sapiens, but all of the other homos are people too. The Homo neanderthalensis, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo floresiensis, they're all people. And we often, I think it's very easy to forget that in a lot of the museum spaces that we're in.
I think this is a slightly morbid turn to this conversation, but I keep seeing this particular question being asked, and that is not something that I'm good to answer. But at what point do we count this as grave robbing, and what point do we count this as actual paleo anthropological research?
Exactly. Like, do you know what the ultimate derivation of the word mummy is from?
No, I do not.
So, like, Victorian era Europeans, they would, based on ancient, supposedly Greek medical knowledge, they would extract essentially oils and exudates from the remains of mummies that they would use in strange medical concoctions, and that substance was called mummia.
Oh, I know this. Yeah. That's why mummies were really popular for a long time, because people keep using it in medicine and things like that.
Yeah, and exactly. It's that people were harvesting the corpses of these ancient peoples and just grinding them up to make into bizarre, useless medical paste, and that's very related to the Western conception of Egyptology and its origin.
Yeah, I do agree. In terms of like exposing the mummies for public view is not my particular favorite. I think the sarcophagus themselves, like where the mummy was stored, would be something interesting for people to see, as people recognize that the Egyptian artwork was among one of the best in its time. And I feel like whenever we think back of a civilization in the past, we immediately get like a very dull imagery of it. Mm-hmm. Maybe black and white if you're thinking like the 1920s or things like that. But they also lived in a very colorful world. And I think seeing the colorful sarcophagus and things like that really bring it to people. But not 112% agree on just showing the mummies of regular old people. Like, they also deserve the right to be, buried in peace and laid to rest in peace.
It's kind of speaking of color in the ancient world. I remember coming across an article somewhere, maybe in like Discover magazine or something, looking at reconstructions of probably how the Sphinx and other ancient Egyptian statuary were painted. And I remember one of their conclusions was that they felt that, the very gaudy, very colorful Las Vegas reconstructions probably aren't entirely far from the truth of the matter, which is something funny to think about. I went to a small chemistry symposium at Emory at one point during high school, and a couple of the speakers there were people who were doing chemical research on things like ancient Egyptian and Greek statuary, the terracotta soldiers from Xi'an, China, and they were doing chemical analysis to try to figure out how these statues were originally painted. And I think that's kind of a neat thing, is that, we think of all of the physical material from classical antiquity, from ancient China, from ancient Egypt as being unpainted rock. But no, it was painted in its time.
Yeah, it was fully painted. Like, they went all out. Here's a little, not a little red, here's a bunch of red with all this blue and the gold and the black eyeliner for sure. It's sad that we lose those particular concepts throughout time, but I think it's nice now that we have the technology to be able to maybe even get a glimpse of what's going on. Because like the marble statue of Greece, if I remember correctly, were also painted and not just white, which is something I think is just amazing, because the Greek statues were the marble star statue is already beautiful to look at, but thinking that, like, knowing that it was also in color, just does something more to the soul.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting stuff out there, and it's interesting to think about how we approach these things and how we visualize the past. Obviously, as paleontologists, that's something that we're very interested in. It's always fun to get to talk about museums, so I'm glad we could discuss that here for a moment. So one other thing that I like talking about with my guests are media presentation of the sciences. And
Okay, yes, go on, please.
I see you have some thoughts already. Go ahead and lay 'em on us.
All right, so this comes very recently. This came out very recently, but the Discovery Channel recently came out with Dino Hunters and absolutely blew my mind in a bad way. Dino Hunter essentially feature ranchers and cowboys who are, private landowners, and they have vertebrate dinosaurs, vertebrate fossils, particularly dinosaurs, on their land, and they're excavating it, and they are selling these fossils, which all the list of things that are wrong is already being listed, including, I think it portrays a very it continued to perpetuate this very interesting image of paleontology being this very Indiana Jones esque view field. Like, we're out there with a cowboy hat and we're just like looking at the wasteland. It's just like, there are dinosaurs out there, boys. We're gonna go.
And then there are hills.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like that anymore. We've been trying our best to be more diverse and include more people of a variety of backgrounds and ethnicity and cultural and socioeconomic background in order to get different points of view in our science, because different points of view in science is important. Yay! But this particular show right now just is continually perpetuating a view that paleo is trying to stray away from. It glorified the selling of fossils. I know some fossil selling can be, I guess I'm a little on the verge for fossil selling, because sometimes some fossil selling is what it is. Like some invert fossil selling, there's just so much that it's really hard to keep track of all. But in terms of vertebrate fossils, those are relatively like hard to come by, and that they are really important data points in our study. And when you sell those fossil and those fossil falls into private hand, they become inaccessible to all scientists, and therefore makes it really difficult for us to include in our science, which require the specimen to be accessible to all scientists.
And compounding that, these sorts of commercial explorations often don't collect the kind of in the field insight, evidence, and context that we need in order to understand the position of these fossils relative to the different sedimentary layers, and how different deposits of fossils can relate to each other both in time and in space and environment. And the needs and drivers of commercial paleontology are very different than the aims of academic paleontology, and that kind of the work of commercial paleontologists does not always preserve or capture the information that we as academics need in order to grow the amount of knowledge that we can extract from these materials.
I completely agree. The loss of those particular data could turn a fossil that would be an incredible find for science into something that is just mediocre. This particular so one of these specimens obviously being featured on this show is a T-Rex. This T-Rex could be just an incredible find in terms of what it could tell us in the Tyrannosaurus evolution, but without any locality, without any of the geology, without any of the other materials. This is just another T-Rex. And it's not good because, again, some of these big specimens are really hard to come by for us to study.
Yeah, and I don't want to completely vilify commercial paleontologists here. I am a collector of fossils. I've bought a number of fossils. The vast majority of stuff that I either personally collect or have paid for is generally invertebrate specimens, things like bivalves, a lot of trilobites, things that tend to be relatively abundant. And when I have bought vertebrate material, it's been things like Nidia, which is a small fish from the Green River Formation that
Mm-hmm.
is abundant to the point where it's useful for paleontologists to have access to large amounts of these things because then you can do population studies.
Yeah.
But it also means that they're abundant enough that you don't lose the kind of information by buying one of those things and entering it into a private collection that you do lose when a large vertebrate or a particularly rare small vertebrate enters into a private collection.
Yeah, I completely with you on that point because there are many paleontological finds that would not have happened if it wasn't for the local fossil hunters.
Exactly. That there's a lot of
China is really important spot. Mongolia is a huge important spot also. There's small various areas and things like that. So am in no way, putting down the local fossil hunters. I'm just saying that this particular show is more of a reality TV show than it is truly scientific. And, you know, if you're going to watch it, please take it with a grain of salt
right.
because it's not what paleo is like here. We are very careful with our specimen and not just dig it out of the side of uh, the cliff with a backhoe. Please don't put a backhoe to your specimen. Be careful. But it is what it is. And this show, I think, comes at kind of the wrong time.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And like you're saying, in terms of showing what paleontology is and who does paleontology, we've obviously talked a lot about here in this interview and in other interviews about field work, but paleontology is not exclusively field work. You don't have to be an outdoorsy person to be a paleontologist. You don't have to have grown up going out to field localities every summer to be a paleontologist. There's a lot of stuff that you can do in labs, even from your home now, as
yes,
we're all discovering in different ways that can contribute to our knowledge of paleontology, and that's valid things, and that paleontology should be open to everyone and to all voices.
I completely agree. I think people underestimate how much a museum collection has.
Mm-hmm.
To be honest, sometimes they're just you see the museum display and you're like, oh man, these are amazing. But for every amazing display quality museum specimen, there is another 10 of different specimens of different quality that are being stored in the museum. And sometimes we just don't have enough people to look at all of them for us to understand more about these specimens. And therefore, we would love to have more people come look at our museum specimens and things like that.
There is a blog that is sadly discontinued, but that really touches on this subject and that I love recommending to people. And so, Khan, I thank you very gladly that you've given me a chance to shill for this particular blog on my podcast. But the blog is called The Underwhelming Fish Fossil of the Month. It was a series written by Mark Carnall, who is a museum paleontologist. At the time he was writing the blog, he was at the University College of London, but he is now at another institution, also in England.
Mm-hmm.
And every month he was the director of, I believe, both fish fossils and marine invertebrates at the University College of London. And every month he would highlight a particular fish fossil that was a combination of something that is either too common to really be of particular interest,
Oh,
incomplete to really be visually interesting or really all that good for research, or too poorly preserved to have that much information, but that was still part of the museum collection. So it's looking at the stuff that's in the back rooms of the collections rather than the things that are put out on display and giving them their little 5 minutes of fame that they'd never have again. And it's really a delightful and very entertaining blog that I heartily recommend to people who want to learn a little bit more about what kind of the uglier, plainer side of paleontology looks like in terms of the fossils.
yeah. One of my favorite things to do when I go to a collection to visit. So I not only do vertebrate fossil collections. I also work on like the more modern collection, as I mentioned earlier, and this could be preserved in what we call skins or fluid preservation. So the skins is just like what it is. It's the skin of the particular animal. The fluid preservation is when you take an animal and then you fix it in formalin and then you store it in high concentration ethyl alcohol to, this is for more like dissection and wet dissection and things like that. But one of my favorite things to do whenever I go into any collection is, I look at the things that I want to see while I'm here, but then I just go through the collection and look through it. There's always something new that amazes me, and there's always something cool to see, regardless of what I study or whether it is relevant to what I study. It's one of my favorite things. It's just be completely immersed and get kind of lost a little bit in the collection, and it's just very soothing because then the collection usually have nobody in it and you're just by yourself and there's this silence and you're like, whoa.
I was on a tour of some of the research collections at the La Brea Tar Pits at one point last summer, and they have a whole bunch of trays of all of the interesting animals that they've recovered from the tar pits. And I distinctly remember one tray that I just loved that tray so much. It was labeled Weird Bones. And sadly, I didn't have time to, I was part of a tour, and so I had to keep going, but I didn't
Yeah.
stick around and figure out, is this bones that they couldn't identify? Is this bones that had unusual pathologies or signs of illness? Was this bones that were like broken and healed in strange ways? I really wanted to learn more about what these weird bones were.
Can you imagine just standing there and you're like, what are these slivers of things? And then the paleontologist is like, we don't know either. That's why it's in here.
Yeah, that's a good question. I try not to think about that shelf too much. Slide back in, pulls out, pulls out one of the 50 trays of dire wolves.
Oh my god, the direwolf collection that they have is just
Yeah,
amazing.
it's spectacular. If you are interested in the paleontology of good boys and girls, it is hard to beat the collections of the La Brea Tar Pits.
Most definitely, most definitely. It's on my list of places to go
It's fun.
for
It's
sure.
a neat place. One thing that's kind of cool is immediately outside the museum, uh, it's kind of a little semi-fenced-in field area, and if you walk around long enough, you can find places where the tar is bubbling out into the grass.
Oh, that's so cool. You
And
could be your own fossil.
yeah. One thing that they do is if like too much is bubbling out, they'll put orange safety cones on top of the little tar bubble away from it, or they'll have like little temporary fences around it. It's
Oh, that's great. I love it. I love it.
the La Brea Tar Pits is also right next to a small but very nice Japanese art museum and a larger kind of modern art museum, and so that part of town has a lot of things to fill a day or two of exploration. And
Oh, I bet.
I recommend both of those spaces. The architecture of the Japanese museum is pretty neat. It kind of takes you through an ascending set of spirals where you, along both the inside and outside wall of the spiral, you're looking at kind of different themes of art.
Okay, okay. I mean, the LA area is definitely on my list of places to go explore, and so that I will put that on my list. Speaking of tours, one time when I was in the Smithsonian, I was looking for a particular specimen, and some of these specimens were really big, and so they're in this big vat. I think it's like 4 feet tall kind of vat. And when I grab something in the vat, I have to slightly be in the vat to get it just because I'm kind of short. And I didn't realize that there was going to be a tour happening. And so I'm just in here, with my headphones on, trying to find the specimen that I'm looking for. And all of a sudden, a whole group of people comes in as I pulled out a bearded vulture. And if anybody knows about a bearded vulture, you will realize that they are enormous. I think they're about the size of my torso, and I'm about 5'3". And so they're enormous. And I'm just like bringing out this big vulture and like meeting my eyes lock onto the group. And I was like, oh, there's a group coming. And everyone's like,
There.
oh, that's so cool. And I was like, oh.
Fancy running into you.
I was like, oh, I was not expecting seeing like 10 people in here. I thought I was going to be alone for the whole week. Oh man, so that was an interesting part of my visit. Tour groups definitely are important for sure for the museum to show the underside of their operation. And I think if the local museums that are near, anybody offer those behind the scene tour, oh my god, please take it. Those are amazing.
Mm-hmm. Very much
Those,
agree that if you ever have a chance to visit the actual collections of a museum, in addition to just the public displays, it's always a very interesting experience. You run into a lot of stuff that's really cool. It's not necessarily the stuff that's complete enough to put out on public display, but stuff that's really worth your time to see.
and you might be able to see a bunch of researchers in their natural habitat. I think those are hilarious because for some of us who are working down there, we don't expect to interact with anyone for a long time. I think I've gone to a collection sometime that I didn't talk to anybody for a week. Like I didn't see anybody for a week, that kind of thing. And so seeing tour group and get to be able to chat with them, maybe just a couple of sentences, is really nice. And we would love for the public to see more of what's going on.
Yeah. Kind of backtracking a moment, we were talking a little bit about recent media that presents the paleosciences, and I wanted to draw our listeners' attention to a kind of more positive depiction of paleontology today, and that is an ongoing PBS documentary series called Prehistoric Road Trip, hosted by Emily Graslie, I believe it's. I have not had a chance to watch it yet, but I intend to catch up with it online as soon as I can figure out how to access that PBS thing. But it is on most PBS stations on Wednesdays at either 9 or 10. And I'm sure it's rebroadcast at some point, but you'd have to check your local TV listings. And so if you have a television, I heartily recommend that you watch it. I know for these past 2 weeks, it's also been aired side by side with other paleontological programs. I believe last week's was a Nova special on Australia's Ediacaran and Cambrian fossils, which is stuff very near and dear to my heart.
Yes, yes. I highly recommend that particular documentary. It shows not only great science, but also a good chunk of diversity in paleontology from time to time too. But yes, definitely recommend. Eons has been really good too with their science and who they feature and the topic they feature. So I think there's been really good up and coming shows.
I met one of the producers of Eons at one point. Sadly, I can't remember his name, but he was one of, not one of the scientists behind it, but one of like the TV show producers for it.
Yeah.
He, was at last year's GSA convention, and I happened to run into him when I was manning Virginia Tech's advertising booth.
Oh, that's really cool.
I have his business card here somewhere. I'd have to go back and find it, but that was pretty neat. Seeing some of the it's like Khan was saying, Eons. It's a great little YouTube series made by PBS that talks about all sorts of topics in paleontology in like 5 to 10 minute chunks with some nice animations. It's worth your time.
Agreed. Completely agreed.
Well, thank you for joining us today, Connor. Are there any other topics in paleo, the sciences? Oh, I almost forgot to ask you about another hobby of yours that I think the audience would like to hear about. You're very interested in nature photography and bird photography in general.
Yes, I started picking up bird photography when I started doing birding. I think not that it goes side by side with it, but I end up finding myself to be much more intently focused into what I'm doing with my camera. It's a rather expensive hobby for anybody who wants to go into it, not gonna lie. My current camera setup is just a very basic beginner camera setup, but the one that I want to upgrade to will cost me about 7 grand. Um, so I would say that it's a relatively expensive hobby for you to go into. But if you don't need to, a photo of that bird that you saw and you just want to go bird watching, it's a very nice hobby. I think it's super relaxing. You're out in the middle of, you know, of a field just looking for birds, and it's a very low key and relaxing hobby to have. Highly recommend for sure.
What is the rarest or most interesting bird you've been able to get a picture of?
Oh gosh. Maybe not the rarest, but I came across this. So a red-tailed hawks are very common in where I've come from, so in Oklahoma. Like if you are driving on a highway, every other telephone pole, there's definitely a red-tailed hawk sitting there. So they're not rare by any point. But one time, my friend and I was going through a wetland to photograph some waterfowl because they were coming through the area, and we came across this particular red-tailed hawk that saw us. It was, perching pretty normally for a red-tailed hawk, and it saw us, made eye contact with us, and then tried to fly away, but didn't really flew away. Just sort of like
Like,
tuck its tuck its leg into the corner of where the branches like branch off, and then spread its wings out so that it's like trying to blend into the tree, and then continually looking at us, and we're just like, what is this behavior? We were completely flabbergasted on what it was trying to do, and it just sort of sat there with its wings spread and just sort of like flattened itself as much as possible. And we're both sitting here like, I've never seen a hawk or any birds do this. And then after about 5-10 minutes, it realized that we still see it. It just sort of hopped back into its normal, perching stance and just continually stare at us. So I think my favorite photo was from when that hawk just sort of like tried to flatten itself and was like, "You don't see me." And
it was making itself look big so it would scare you vicious predators away.
oh yeah, we were totally vicious, totally vicious. So I think that might be my rarest photo, like just a really strange behavior from this, adult, adult red-tailed hawk.
What's one of the top birds that you want to be able to photograph someday?
Hummingbirds. They're so small and they're so fast. And I'm just sitting here like, oh man, I need good photographing skills for those. I think things that I want to photograph.
My
There's just so many. There's just so
my
many.
undergrad research advisor, a really great paleontologist named Dr. Sally Walker,
Mhm.
she has gone on some interesting nature vacations to where she could go and photograph blue-footed boobies, and I remember she was quite excited for that.
Oh, that would be so neat. Oh my gosh. I'd be excited. Those nature trips are expensive.
Yeah, yeah.
I was sometimes didn't believe my eyes when I saw those. I was like, "Whoa,
Ooh.
that's not including airplane tickets." Whoa, girl, that's a lot. But I think it's a relatively good, you know, not combining the camera costs and things like that. But if you just want to go out and do birding, or you just want to go out and do herping, those are relatively, low cost activities. And, I would say that it's very pandemic safe activities to do because, the lesser the group, the more you encounter, I usually in my perspective. And
And
so,
just to clarify for our audience, herping is going out into the wild and looking for lizards and amphibians
yes, yes. And snakes.
and
And
snakes.
snakes. For sure. But those two particular hobby I find that get you closer to understanding the area that you live in and the biodiversity that is there. Like most people don't know that, we have praying mantis in Virginia.
I didn't know that carnivorous plants like Venus flytraps, I didn't know those things were native to the Carolinas.
Yes, I agree. See, like you would never know that if you didn't go outside. So I think this is a really good time for us to get closer to our nature. And I sound like a hippie saying this, uh, but I think it's nice just because. Sometimes you could go foraging for things out in the forest. I definitely had my time, like enjoying my time more mushroom hunting with some
That's
part
a
of the
really good
group.
song.
Say what?
I said that's a really good song by Yoko Kanno and the Seatbelts.
Time to put the link down. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for your time, Kanats. I'm glad you could join us today.
Thanks for having me. This was so fun.
So, Khan, inquiring minds want to know, where does the green fern grow?
I would say the green fern grows wherever you want the green fern to grow. They're pretty hardy little things.
So you'd say that the green fern grows wherever the green fern goes?
Yeah, yeah. You know, it is a free world, and if you want to travel and let your green fern, forest wherever it wants to forest, you do that. But do be safe. Keep social distancing, and also wear a mask.
Let your green fern fly.
Yes, most definitely.
Hello. This is a part of the show where I'd like to step back for a moment and talk about an issue facing a prominent museum right now. Some of you in the audience might remember 2 years ago, back in 2018, that the National Museum of Brazil experienced a terrible fire that destroyed a large number of its collections. During that time and in the immediate aftermath, there was a great deal of media attention pointing out how national funding of Brazil's museum systems left it very unprepared to address infrastructural issues like susceptibility to fire damage, and that many other museums were in similar vulnerabilities towards damage. A couple of weeks ago, another museum in Brazil, specifically the Natural History Museum and Botanical Garden of the Federal University Museum of Minas Gerais, burned down. Again, lost in this museum is an irreplaceable trove of both anthropological, mineralogical, and paleontological wonders. And currently, the museum is not taking donations, but with the help of my friend and coworker from Brazil, Matthias Denizin, I'm looking to try to stay in contact with the museum. Currently, they are working on cataloging what all materials were lost and what all materials remain. And sometime, hopefully within the next coming weeks, they will start soliciting donations. And once they do so, I intend to make a donation, and I invite you guys as members of the audience to also donate to this museum and other museums that face need in these trying times internationally. Museums serve a great deal not only in teaching members of the public like me and like you guys about all sorts of facets of our history, of our national history, and of our culture, but they also are invaluable resources for research into those same fields. And it's very important that we protect not only that ability to educate, but also that ability to learn and discover new things. And I really hope that we can do things to help protect these kinds of resources. And I hope that of the many museums that are suffering right now, that we can continue to support them and protect their missions. Thank you. I will include a link to the website, and as donations open up to this institution, I will include links to that in future installments of Muview with Mo. Thank you, and have a nice day.